Welcome to Immigreats, the podcast that highlights stories of immigrants making great contributions in their adopted countries. My name is Munatsi Manyande, and I'm your host. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe and now live in Texas in the USA with my family. Today, I'm telling the story of a very, very divisive man who needs no introduction. The story of Elon Musk. Elon Musk was born in South Africa and emigrated to Canada initially and then the United States right after he finished high school. He's lived a very storied life and has become the world's richest man and Time magazine's Person of the Year, among many other accomplishments. But he is a very complicated individual, and I enjoyed reading his life story and learning about him. And I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts on what I learned. I'm going to start by just reading a section of the kind of intro from the new book on Elon Musk by the same name, same title, Elon Musk. It was written by a man named Walter Isaacson. And Walter is an accomplished biographer himself. And he wrote something in the kind of introduction that I wanted to share as a background. When Elon Musk was a kid in South Africa, he was regularly beaten by bullies. One day, a group pushed him down some concrete steps and kicked him until his face was swollen. He was in the hospital for a week, but the physical scars were minor compared to the emotional ones inflicted by his father, an engineer, rogue, and charismatic fantasist. His father's impact on his psyche would linger. He developed into a tough yet vulnerable man-child with an exceedingly high tolerance for risk, a craving for drama, and an epic sense of mission, together with a maniacal intensity that was callous and at times destructive. I wanted to just set the stage with that because if you get an opportunity to read this book on Elon Musk, it'll all make sense. This introduction will make sense. He's a fascinating individual, very accomplished, and somebody that I do admire in many ways, but also have lots of reasons to not admire him. Let's get into the story of Elon Musk. Elon Musk was born and raised in apartheid South Africa. His mother was born in Canada, but had been raised primarily in South Africa after her family had moved from Canada to South Africa. And Elon Musk's father, had been born and raised in South Africa himself. Elon's father has been documented as a racist himself. In fact, not long ago, he made some comments about how he believes that South Africa is going to the dogs, and that's really because black people are now in charge. He essentially wishes for the good old days when there was a white South Africa and a black South Africa, and they didn't really mix and come together. And so that's the man, that raised Elon Musk. His name was Errol Musk. His mother is May Musk, and is a fascinating individual herself. She herself was a finalist for the Miss South Africa beauty pageant, so she's been a model from a young age, and even now, I believe, has done some shoots for Vogue magazine, even now as a woman who's in her 70s at this point. Elon's dad was an engineer, very technical, very bright man mathematically, and it's believed that a lot of Elon's genius he gets from his father. The unfortunate thing is, it looks like he inherited more than the positive attributes from his father, and he's been having to live with that all his life. As I was reading about Elon growing up in apartheid South Africa, I actually remembered a trip that I took to South Africa as a little boy. I must have been 9 or 10 years old. And this was before the end of apartheid, I should say. I remember it was actually a road trip. We took the trip with my father and my mother. I think my sister was there. I forgot to ask her. And we took a road trip from Harare and crossed over the border into South Africa. And I think there was some specific shopping that my parents wanted to do, some things that they wanted to get in South Africa that they couldn't get in Zimbabwe for some reason. And I remember on the trip, I said to my parents that the one thing I wished for that I wanted to take back home was a mountain bike. I was 9, 10 years old. A lot of my friends in the neighborhood had bikes, and I wanted a mountain bike because at that point, that was what was cool. And so my parents agreed that if we could get one, if we could find one that they could afford, that they'd buy me a mountain bike that we'd bring back home. And I remember walking into a store, a shop that had mountain bikes, kids' bikes and everything, and falling in love with a particular bike that had was an 18-speed bike with all the gears and looked really cool. And unfortunately, it was more expensive than what my parents were prepared to pay. I think the other issue that was there was that I think the store didn't have many adult-sized bikes. And because I was 9 and 10 years old, my parents, being the African parents that they were, wanted to get me a bike that I could grow into. And I don't even know kind of how this happened, but we ended up in some back alley at some store, some person who was selling used adult bikes. I remember having to pick between two not very nice looking bikes that not what I had imagined, but I basically was told, hey, it's either one of these two or no bike at all. I ended up going with this bike that I remember the brand of it was called the Bomber bike. And it was big. I mean, it was in a full adult bike, and I was a 9-year-old at that stage. Now, I could ride it, but it certainly wasn't a bike I was ready to ride all the time at that age. I had to go with that one. The other thing I hated about that Bomber bike was that at that point in time, what was in fashion, what was in vogue, were these mountain bikes that had the straight handlebars. And this particular Bomber bike, because I wouldn't be surprised if it was 10 years old at this point already, had the kind of the curved handlebars that made it felt like a grandpa bike. So even though it did have the gears and all the other bells and whistles, it really felt like a bike that my dad should have been buying for himself or for his dad even. That was the bike I got, and I remember putting it in the trunk of my dad's sedan, and so the trunk wouldn't shut, and we had to use rope to shut the trunk to be able to drive back to the border in Zimbabwe and hit crossover. And what's funny is this would have been like 30 years ago, and that bike actually still exists in Zimbabwe because once I left Zimbabwe to come to the US for university, one of my cousins named George was able to get that bike from my dad, and he used it for many years himself, and I'm pretty sure he still has it. So I guess my dad was right that this was a bike that would last forever. Another memory from this trip was the feeling, the looks that we got whenever we walked into stores. So we drove to a city that's now called Polokwane in South Africa, and I believe it used to be called Pietermaritzburg or Petersburg, I think, if I remember correctly. And it was a very white city. Anyone who knew apartheid South Africa knew that black people and white people just mingled only when necessary. So when you walked into a store, you typically were working into stores where there were some black people that worked there. The stores were owned by the white people that were in there, and most of the shoppers in those stores in that part of town that we were in were white. And I remember feeling very conscious. In fact, that might have been the first time in my life that I was conscious of the color of my skin, of my blackness, because I'd grown up in Zimbabwe where I was always a member of the majority. And so I'd never had to be conscious about the color of my skin. But I think on that particular trip, and I think because South Africa too, at that time, there were fights for kind of pushing back against apartheid. And so you'd hear stories of some attacks that would happen where people would get shot, some bombs going off in different places as part of the tension that was in the country at the time. And so I think being aware of that as a 9-10-year-old boy, your imagination does tend to run wild. So I do remember walking into these stores and being very conscious of the color of my skin, and also kind of hoping that my parents would make their shopping decisions really quickly so we could get out and move on to somewhere else, just because I just was nervous. It wasn't until, in fact, when I finally went to high school that I ended up being in an environment where there were multiple races that I was around. So my primary education was mostly in schools that were mostly black students, mostly black teachers. And then when I got to high school, because I went to a private school in the city that was once upon a time exclusively for white Zimbabweans or white Rhodesians from before Zimbabwe was independent, I found myself in a school then in high school where 50% of the people around me were white. And that, eventually I got used to that, and I think it was probably kind of a good transition for what life would hold for me once I left Zimbabwe to go to university, especially because I was going to come to America and end up in a small town university in the middle of the state of Missouri where there weren't that many black people. So just interesting experiences from that. Like I mentioned, Elon's father, Elon Musk, was definitely somebody that wanted apartheid South Africa to remain apartheid South Africa, and the changes that have happened since the end of apartheid in 1994 were not changes that he's welcomed even now in his old age. The dad himself too, Errol, is a weird person, definitely does not follow the moral code that most people would follow. So the way he raised his children, the language, the things he would say to his children, the language he would use. His wife, May, left him after they had had 3 kids. Elon was their first child, and she left because he was verbally and physically abusive and had lots of anger issues, temper, something that Elon himself has been known for, having a bad temper. Another just crazy thing about Elon's dad is that years later, like just in the last 15 years, Elon's dad, Errol, ended up having a child with one of his stepdaughters. So after Elon's mom left Errol, married another woman, and the woman he married had a couple of young kids. At the time that they got married, this woman had a 4-year-old daughter. And so he helped raise this daughter and then eventually got divorced for a second time, divorced this woman's mother. And when she was in her 20s, she had a child with Errol. So he basically had a child with his stepdaughter. And then I believe they ended up having a second child, and I think they're even married now. And so, again, just a real weird dynamic, and it's something that Elon has problems with and hates, and he's kind of cut off his dad numerous times over the years, and this thing of him marrying his stepdaughter really, really upset Elon and caused Elon to not want to associate with his dad for a long time. I know that Elon's siblings, his brother and his sister, have cut off his dad completely because of the person he is and all that. From reading the book, though, it sounds like Elon keeps going back. He cuts off his dad and says, I don't want anything to do with you for a while, and then he kind of goes back and reconnects. I don't know much about psychology or anything like that, but it feels to me like Elon continues to kind of yearn for his dad's approval, I think, and so maybe he keeps reaching back out in an effort to try to get that approval, which he doesn't get because the dad is not very cool. His mom was also very intelligent in school and also great at math and sciences and things like that. And so it really isn't a surprise that Elon is very mathematical and has a passion for mathematics and physics and those core sciences. Elon in school was a genius, really, really smart kid. But his first few schools that he attended called in his parents at some point and actually thought that there was something wrong with him. In fact, one of the report cards that they got from the school actually talked about Elon Musk. The school basically said to them, "We think your son might be retarded," and that's a direct quote. And I think based on what we know now, Elon Musk definitely has autism, like he's on the autistic spectrum. And I'm guessing that back in the 70s, maybe there wasn't that much understanding of autism and what that means. And so what they were calling retardation might have just been just him operating as somebody with autism. So he was brilliant, caught on to stuff real quick, but also ended up being really bored really quickly in school because I think he just wasn't stimulated by the kind of education that the typical school made available. It's also been believed that Elon might have something called Asperger's, which is something I don't know very much about, but also his behavior, his erratic behavior as an adult, his lack of empathy, his just inability to empathize and put himself in other people's shoes seems to suggest that. And I actually saw an interview where he was asked if he thought he might have Asperger's, and he did say he thought it was really possible that he did. In 1989, when Elon was 18 years old, he decided that he wanted to leave South Africa. And the place that he wanted to go to was America. And that was because he was fascinated with science and he felt like coming to America would be a way to put him on the cutting edge of science and technology and development. But he didn't have a way to emigrate to America directly. And so what he ended up doing was following up. I mentioned earlier that his mother was born in Canada. So his mother was a Canadian citizen who'd grown up in South Africa. So he ended up following up through the Canadian embassy in South Africa to claim Canadian citizenship through his mom. And basically, as soon as he got his Canadian passport, a week later, he was on a flight and left South Africa and moved to Canada. And then he lived and worked in Canada for a few years, even started university in Canada, and then eventually transferred to the University of Pennsylvania in America from a university in the Toronto area. And that was kind of him moving to America and getting a taste of what America would be like. By the time he was in Canada and even in university in Pennsylvania, his entrepreneurial side was starting to show itself because he'd already done some really neat things in Canada to make some money. He'd identified some arbitrage opportunities with certain investments and certain bonds that were available for investment and things like that, and enjoyed kind of unpacking those types of things. When he was in university in Pennsylvania, a story that's shared that reminded me of my university days was that he and his roommate for a season would throw parties in their house that they rented and charge college students to come and party in that house on the weekends and charge them for alcohol. So they'd have unlimited alcohol and music, and then people would pay $5 to come in. And I think saying that sometimes they'd have 400 people that would show up. And so I don't think that was a very big house, but I can just imagine being the landlord who owned that property, because I'm sure it got trashed significantly and regularly. But anyway, that story reminded me of my college days in Missouri, because I actually made a little bit of money for myself in my senior year of high school, and I needed it because I kind of needed some money to help pay for school. But I had enough relationships on campus where people knew me and I had friends, and I could invite people to a party, and people would show up. And so on 3 or 4 occasions, the university I went to is in a small town in Missouri called Warrensburg, and Warrensburg has a street named Pine Street, and Pine Street is the party street. Every college town, I think, has a party street, and in Warrensburg it was Pine Street. And I remember going and connecting with one of the bar owners on Pine Street and saying, "Hey, look, I want to throw a party every once in a while where we bring in international students with American students together and kind of be meticulous about the music playlist so it kind of has an international flavor to it and all this stuff," and negotiated us being able to use this bar for parties. And so students would come and actually pay money to enter. And the first time we did it, I remember I got to keep the money people paid to enter the bar, and then the owner kept the money from all the drinks and the alcohol sales. But by the second time I was doing it, I'd kind of realized that I was leaving money on the table, so I went back and renegotiated the deal and said to the owner of the bar, "Hey, based on how it went the first time around, I know you made some money, and I think this time around I can get more people to come. And so if you agree, I'll get more people to come, we'll make it bigger and we'll make more money, but I want a little percentage on the money that you make at the bar." And we kind of went back and forth for a while, but eventually he said yes. And I ended up making some money to kind of pay bills and help pay off my tuition and things by throwing a party every few weeks until I graduated. So I enjoyed reading about that, about Elon's days in the party promotion business, because it reminded me of my days as a college student. The first time Elon went back to South Africa was actually in the early 2000s. I think it was around 2001. So he'd been gone for almost 12 years. And so he went back to South Africa, got to reconnect with family. By that point, his mother and siblings had also moved to Canada. So his dad had stayed in South Africa. So he went back, spent some time with his dad and cousins and other family members. And when he came back to the U.S., he got really, really sick. It turned out later that Elon had picked up malaria while he was in South Africa, and when he came back, got really sick, and all the tests that they had done, nobody was thinking about malaria because it's not a disease that you can get in this side of the world, simply because the mosquitoes that carry malaria are found kind of in tropical regions. And so he got really sick to the point of almost dying with this. And this was at a time when he'd already started a couple of businesses. He'd started a business that ended up becoming PayPal, and they eventually sold it for a real fortune for Elon, and that was his big cash out, his first big cash out from his entrepreneurial activities. But I was laughing when I was reading his biography, because after he recovered from his bout of malaria, he was quoted to have said to somebody, "What I've learned from this, I've learned 2 lessons from my trip to South Africa and my sickness. The first lesson is that vacations will kill you, so don't ever take vacations. And the second lesson is South Africa is still trying to destroy me," because he believed that his father had tried to destroy him as a young kid. And so him going back, he felt like South Africa was still trying to take him out. And that cracked me up. But as I said, Elon had been one of the founders of the business that became PayPal. They ended up selling it, and he ended up walking away with a couple $100 million after it was bought out. PayPal obviously is still a business that exists today. He ended up actually being forced out of PayPal by the other shareholders because he had been the guy that was the CEO and being in charge. But his erratic behavior and just him being really difficult to work with had led to a scenario where the other board members and the other shareholders had voted to remove him as CEO and voted him kind of out of the company. And they eventually sold it. And because he was still a shareholder, he made a lot of money when they finally sold that business. The book talks about just Elon just having these crazy ideas. And part of the fights with his shareholders with PayPal was that he had much, much bigger dreams for what he thought PayPal should grow into than they had. And after he was out of that business, he vowed to himself that he wouldn't work with people that didn't think as big as he did and didn't dare to dream big. So when you hear him talking today about his vision of making human beings multi-planetary, you can kind of understand why. He's always kind of been thinking big and thinks that the humans have destroyed the planet Earth so much that at some point the species is going to need another place to start over. Otherwise, we're just going to die and it'll be the end of humanity. And that's why he started some businesses now where he says the quest of those businesses is to enable flights to places like Mars so that potentially we can go and establish a brand new civilization on that planet. So fascinating stuff. Personally, I think that's some of it is a little bit much for me. I'm okay with just trying to make the most of my time on planet Earth. And when my time comes and I die, I'm no longer here. Just let's leave the next generation to carry on, and let me rest in God's peace after that. I have no plans on taking us to a different planet or encouraging that. As you start to read in the book about Elon's business exploits, I mentioned that the biography I just read by Elon was written by a man named Walter Isaacson. Walter Isaacson also wrote an incredible biography of Steve Jobs of Apple fame. And there's a statement that I remember coming across for the first time when I read the Steve Jobs biography, and this is going back maybe 10 years now. And in this book, Walter Isaacson had said Steve Jobs possessed what they called a reality distortion field. In other words, there were a lot of things that most people see as reality that Steve Jobs would reject and would distort. And in many ways, it made him look and sound crazy, but it also in many ways pushed people to actually create stuff that would change the world. And so Walter Isaacson uses that same phrase to describe Elon Musk. And when he talks about how he got involved with the business that is now Tesla, how he got involved with the business that is SpaceX, that is sending rockets into space, and he believes that's the business that's going to get humanity to Mars and beyond potentially. It talks about just him having the audacity to dream of these things that seem crazy, because of this reality distortion field. But in many ways, it has actually produced results that are undeniably impressive. You take Tesla, for example, for a long time, people thought it would be impossible or extremely difficult to have an electric vehicle that could run on batteries and actually go 400 or 500 miles before it needed a charge. But Tesla's figured it out. They've pulled it off. They've sold over 2 million Teslas all over the world today, and now all the other car manufacturers are scrambling to try to pivot to electric cars too, because they've suddenly realized that, okay, he's proved that it's possible, and there really is a market, there really is an appetite for vehicles that don't run on fossil fuels, and now they're scrambling, but they're behind the eighth ball. In fact, I remember reading a few weeks ago that General Motors and the other legacy car manufacturers have now entered into contracts with Tesla to be able to use Tesla's charging systems on the electric vehicles they're designing, and then to also be able to use their charging stations. And so now Tesla is making a lot of money by charging all these other car manufacturers simply because they solved certain things first and figured certain things first. And now these other legacy manufacturers have no choice but to go to Elon Musk and Tesla and ask for help for it to make business sense for them. And so he's done incredibly well with that business. With SpaceX, he's built a business that is doing way more and way better than NASA was ever able to do. And now his business is contracted by the government to do a lot of stuff that NASA was supposed to be doing. They figured out ways to do a lot more than NASA was doing at a tiny fraction of the cost that NASA was spending, and they're doing so much more than even what was NASA's mandate. And so there's now been kind of a huge rush of other entrepreneurs going into kind of the space race as well. Notably, people like Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson have gone into that race, into that space as well. But none of them have made the kind of progress that Elon Musk has made through SpaceX. And that is just incredibly admirable. As I was reading about Tesla and the process of building that business, in 2007 and 2008, Tesla almost went bankrupt. They almost went broke because they basically were spending money to try to build cars, to build capacity to build cars when they didn't have any revenue. And then the global financial crisis came, and all of a sudden, their ability to get investor money went away. When the global economy goes into recession, naturally investors start holding on to their money, and they're worried about aggressive bets. And so Tesla almost went bankrupt. And things got so bad that Elon, for a while, for several months, didn't have any money for himself. He couldn't feed himself, feed his family. He was relying on his siblings, helping him out financially, and his mom helping out financially, because he'd invested every penny that he'd made from the PayPal sale and from his other investments. All those had gone into Tesla and also into SpaceX. And so Tesla was on the brink of collapse. And somehow, just in time, they were able to get just enough money to start producing cars and start getting some revenue coming in. And that really was a game changer. And as I was reading about that season in his life, I also kind of was having flashbacks to a time when I worked for a startup myself after moving back home from the US after I graduated from college. One of my first jobs that I got was in a startup that was trying to build a couple of businesses in the tech space, technology space, telecommunications and technology space, and then also in the healthcare sector. And I'd gone in really early as probably employee number 5 or 6, and gone in and really had fallen in love with the vision and the mission of the business. And the founder of the business was somebody I admired and respected and really enjoyed working with. And we were trying to build this business. And we worked for a couple of years trying to get this business off the ground, and things didn't work out for us eventually. But I remember also being in a season where the business has no money, but we're trying really hard to make things work. And so we're working 18, 20-hour days. And at the same time, I'm not bringing home any income because there is no money for payroll or any of that, because you're trying to raise some money, investment dollars, or trying to get some financing from financial institutions, and you're kind of in that desperate stage. And you work really hard. I grew so much personally and professionally in that season. But I also remember actually relying on family and friends to be able to make ends meet, because we were just in that season where we just didn't have the money coming in at the business. There are a lot of things I can trace back to that season in my life in terms of how I operate now, how I think as a business person, as an entrepreneur, but also my approach to entrepreneurship and building businesses. In hindsight, I wouldn't give up that period for anything, because I really feel like I grew up. I matured because of those experiences in that season, and I think I'm a better business person today for those experiences. And I think that Musk too became a much better business person once he went through that fire with Tesla, and they were able to grow it. Today, Tesla is an extremely successful business that a lot of people admire. I remember buying some Tesla shares kind of around 2019 and going into the COVID pandemic days. And I'm really, really glad that I did that, because those shares have done really well in the period since then. I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about Elon Musk's personal life. Elon Musk, again, interesting, crazy individual. So he's been married a couple of times. His first wife was a lady named Justine, with whom he had 5 boys with. They got divorced, and he then married another woman who's a British actress named Tallulah Riley, and they were together for a few years, but they never had children together. After Elon had 5 boys with Justine, and then after he broke up with Tallulah Riley, he ended up kind of now going through a season where he was dated some celebrities, musician and actress and things. And he's also, in the last several years, decided that he wanted to have a whole bunch of kids. So as of right now, I believe Elon Musk has 11 or 12 kids. 5 of them with his first wife. He has 3 with the musician artist named Grimes. 3, I think it's 2 boys and a girl. And then he's had a couple of other kids with other people. In fact, in reading the book, I found out that he has twins, a boy and a girl, with a woman that works for him, that's worked for him for a number of years. And what's interesting is that with most of these women, he's had children with them, but they've all gone for in vitro fertilization process. So like with this woman that works for him, it doesn't sound like they've actually had a romantic relationship. It sounds like she worked for him, they got along, were friends, and he'd been encouraging her to have kids. In fact, if you follow him on Twitter, he talks a lot about how the global birth rate declining is a real problem for future generations, and we should be having more kids. And so he jokes about how he's playing his part because he has 11 kids. But yeah, he convinced this woman who works for him to have kids. And when she told him that she wanted to have kids and that she was looking at some sperm banks to find a donor to have a kid with, he volunteered to be the sperm donor. And she, I guess, says she admires him a lot and thought, what better than to have children with the smartest person that I know and someone I really admire. And so he did that. And what was funny and controversial was that he did this while he was in a relationship with this woman named Grimes. And in fact, I think one of his kids with Grimes was born a week or 2 after this woman had his twins. And he'd never said anything to Grimes. In fact, she found out from a third party, and that wasn't real happy about it. And so, I mean, he's he's a different guy. And I think when you learn about Asperger's and maybe him not being able to empathize or put himself in other people's shoes, maybe it starts to explain some of the things that have happened that he's done. I just found that so fascinating in terms of just how he would conduct his personal life that way and not have major issues with it. Elon's also spent the last 8 to 10 years being actively involved in this artificial intelligence space that everybody is talking about. In 2015, Elon helped found the organization that's called OpenAI as a nonprofit. If you've been following activity in this space, OpenAI is the entity that's introduced that chat application that people have been talking about and using to get help for writing grants, writing business proposals, and I suppose even students in school are trying to find ways to use it to make life easier for themselves. So Elon was one of the founders of that entity, but because of his inability to maintain relationships well, he ended up quitting OpenAI and kind of going a different route. And the guys that stayed at OpenAI ended up cutting a deal that involves Microsoft, where they've got a for-profit entity that that Microsoft and OpenAI owns together. And in fact, that's the one that actually released that ChatGPT application that ended up becoming the fastest ever downloaded application in the world, in history. Elon has strong opinions about that, about how OpenAI has conducted itself. He says that they'd agreed to operate as a nonprofit and feels like them pivoting to a for-profit model is wrong and unethical, and said a lot about that stuff. And so he's now spending a lot of time and energy now trying to build different AI businesses that he thinks will have better safeguards for humanity. Elon's big fear is that this race to build artificial intelligence that's going to change the world puts humanity at risk, because we could potentially develop computers that will be able to decide to not listen to a human, so that we could build computers that can decide that I think I now know more than you do as a human, and I've decided I want to eradicate you. And so I don't know if you're a sci-fi kind of person, if you've spent a lot of time in that space, there's been movies around about that kind of stuff over the decades, and he sees that as a real possibility, and he feels like everybody else that's driven by the motive to just get wealthy through artificial could end up creating a monster that will live to regret at some point. So that's been interesting. Through his work with Tesla, they've done a lot of work around artificial intelligence. In fact, Tesla's driver assist program and their full self-driving program is real artificial intelligence at work. Tesla right now is the only car manufacturer that can put you in a car that does come with a full self-driving mode, where I can get into my car right now and drive to a place that's 200 miles away in the middle of a city And technically, the Tesla can actually do all the driving itself and with minimal human intervention. And so there's a lot of people that are excited about it. I know I am, and I am actually wanting to pivot to a place where I can start to enjoy that kind of technology when I drive, for sure. But I know there's a lot of people where that freaks them out and feel like, what happens when the car decides it doesn't want to stop? Or what happens when the car decides that it's going to ram into that pedestrian or whatever? And yeah, so there's a lot to be said around artificial intelligence. Elon himself, too, is an interesting guy. So he's been the world's richest man. It's been worth over $200 billion. His net worth has come down over the last year or so because of the chaos around his purchase of Twitter. And so Tesla stock did go down quite a bit in the last year or so. And so I don't think he's the world's richest man at the moment, but he's really close. But he's built all these businesses and become this multi-billionaire who doesn't seem to be that motivated by money, like at a personal level. So he's making money, but it doesn't seem like the finer things in life are kind of what motivates him in terms of making money. So for example, I read a story in the book about how when they were building the Tesla factory in Nevada, he was living out there for a few months as they were building out this factory, and he was trying to make sure that everybody would keep working hard and working around the clock. That the times that he was staying in Nevada, that he was living in a motel that charged a $20 per night motel. So that tells you everything. I mean, a $20 per night motel is not the kind of place that I would ever want to stay the night. Now, I'm guessing this probably was in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere, where maybe there aren't that many hotel options, but still, he's a billionaire. It probably wouldn't have been that hard to buy a really decked out RV and have it set up somewhere there and be a little bit more comfortable. But he lived in that motel for weeks, paying $20 per night. He doesn't seem to possess he's not the kind of billionaire that wants to have a yacht and all these different things that other people will get. It sounds like his big kind of guilty pleasure is his private jet that he uses, but it also sounds like for him, it's a practical decision to say, because I need to be able to get to different places so quickly, because I'm running all these different businesses and all this, I need to be able to, I don't want to rely on commercial flights because it just would not be efficient from a time perspective, which makes sense to me. I can see that argument for sure. But he is a wealthy man. In fact, back at the time when Tesla was coming out of their struggles in the 2008, 2009 period, because Tesla didn't have any money, he negotiated a compensation package for himself with Tesla, where he said that Tesla could pay him a salary of $1 per year and just pay him with stock options that would vest only if certain aggressive revenue and vehicle production targets were met. And the board agreed to it, but every single person on the board thought that it was a ridiculous package that never have to pay him for, just because the targets that he set for himself just didn't seem plausible. They were ridiculous. But that reality distortion field went to work, I guess, and they worked for a few years, and sure enough, the agreement that they put in place said that if he grew the business of Tesla to a market valuation of $650 billion, then he would be able to cash in on these stock options. And so as we speak today, Tesla is worth 800 and something billion. In fact, they've actually crossed over that $1 trillion mark. I think the $1.5 trillion mark they got to not for a while before the Twitter chaos. And so just from that deal alone, when the Tesla shares hit, the company value got to $650 billion, he got a $56 billion payout from Tesla. And he is also, because of that payout and the money that he made in 2022, he also paid, I think it was like $11 billion in taxes. So he's also now got the distinction of being the individual who's paid the highest ever tax bill in the history of the world. And just it's kind of crazy, fascinating stuff. Elon Musk also created a business called Starlink, which is an satellite internet service provider. So they've been launching satellites basically through Starlink, and I think it's a SpaceX subsidiary. They've been launching satellites into orbit that are specifically designed to give internet access to remote areas. And so what's been really neat for me is I actually just saw something a few days ago, an article that said that the government in Zimbabwe, my home country of my birth, are very close to announcing that they're authorizing Starlink to start providing internet services in Zimbabwe. And I see that as a big deal because you don't get very good quality internet services in Zimbabwe or in most of the African countries that I've been to once you get outside of the city limits. And even the internet that you can get inside the city limits is extremely expensive. In fact, Zimbabwe is actually one of the 5 most expensive countries in the world in terms of internet access. And so having Starlink services available in Zimbabwe, I see that as a game changer because in some parts of Africa, you can get really good speed internet access through Starlink for $30 or $40 a month. In comparison, the types of speeds that you can get for $30 or $40 a month through Starlink, right now in Zimbabwe, you probably need $200 to $250 a month for those same speeds to be guaranteed. So I'm excited about that in terms of what that means for the country of Zimbabwe, for the continent of Africa, and then also just for other developing nations around the world. I think that's a really neat thing that's coming. And there was quite a bit of talk in the news about Starlink to do with the war in Ukraine, because when Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the things that they did initially was to target all their telecommunications infrastructure. And so they hit a lot of the Ukraine's telecommunications infrastructure, and so internet access actually was minimal or non-existent in certain parts of Ukraine. And so Elon Musk and Starlink shipped Starlink terminals quickly to Ukraine, and that started to help the Ukrainian government and even the military in Ukraine to be able to communicate and to try to fight back. And there was some controversy because there was a time sometime last year, where apparently Ukraine was getting ready to attack Russia's naval fleet that was around the Crimea region. So Crimea region was Russia took it back from Ukraine in 2014. And that's a real contested portion of land. And Ukraine was getting ready to attack a fleet that was in Crimea or around the Crimean Peninsula. And when Musk and his team found out about that, they ended up making a call and cutting off the internet, the Starlink internet, and stopping the Ukrainian military from carrying out the attack. They took a lot of heat for that because a lot of people felt like that meant that Musk and Starlink were siding with Russia and Putin in that decision. But in the book, he explains that he felt like that was going to be the kind of provocation that could escalate to actual nuclear war and potentially the Third World War from their thoughts and their analysis. And I don't know enough about foreign affairs and some of those types of things to be an expert, so I don't really have strong opinions on that. But that was something that was really debated. Something I learned about Elon Musk as well, because of his personality and kind of him having this Asperger's and so on. He's a very difficult person to work for. He expects people to work around the clock for him. So he's been known to get really mad to walk into the office on a Friday at midnight or 1 a.m. on Saturday, and get really mad that the people went home. And so he's the kind of person who will call people home. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Why aren't you in the office? That kind of guy. He's one of those people where work-life balance is not a thing. You should just be working all the time. And in fact, when he took over the company Twitter, one of the things that made him really mad once he started to kind of understand what was inside the business was the fact that Twitter had a corporate culture that was it was too accommodating, in his opinion. He felt like the business cared too much about employees' feelings and didn't care enough about employees' performance. And there were just so many things that he immediately outlawed once he took over the business. And then in the news, there was lots of stories about how he ended up firing over 90% of Twitter's workforce. And a lot of it was to do with that, and him feeling like there were too many people in the company that were infected with what he calls the woke mind virus and so on. So it's just a fascinating kind of story, because even when you look at Musk in terms of a political ideology, for a long time it sounds like he was somebody who supported kind of the more liberal, more democratic candidates. In fact, he was a big supporter of Barack Obama being president. But of late, he's talked about if he was voting today, he feels like he'd vote more Republican than he would Democrat, because he feels like the Democratic Party has, been taken over by this woke mind virus that he calls about, and he thinks that's not a good thing. And he's gotten a lot of pushback from that, and also a lot of pushback from his own kids, because now his kids are his older kids are college age or teenagers that are really intelligent and obviously are on social media and know what's going on in the world. And so they see and hear all these stories of their father being demonized, and just also some of the things that he does on social media that he probably shouldn't do as a CEO, as an adult, as a father, and things like that. And in fact, there seems to have been some significant collateral damage from a personal standpoint for Elon Musk, because one of his 5 kids, I mentioned that he had 5 sons with his first wife, Justine, and he had a son whose name was Xavier, who at age 16 decided that he wanted to transition to a girl. And so at age 16, he transitioned to a girl, changed names to Jenna. And as soon as Jenna turned 18, Jenna went to the court and immediately said, I want to change my last name. I don't want anything to do with the name Musk and all this. And Jenna will not talk to the father. Jenna hates the father's political positions that he's taken. Jenna does not like the fact that the father is a billionaire. Jenna seems to believe that billionaires are bad for the world and bad for, they just have too much power and can't stand that. And from the book, you can tell that is something that bothers him. And you kind of just start to see these things kind of being passed on from generation to generation, right? So his father's erratic behavior, his father's poor parenting and not being available for his kids in the way that his kids needed him, in some ways the same is happening to Elon's kids themselves, and it's causing pain and frustrations for the children and for him, and it's just a tough thing to deal with. In conclusion, I wanted to wrap this particular episode up by reading a small excerpt from the conclusion of the book by Walter Isaacson, which I think is appropriate. He asked the question, but would a restrained Musk accomplish as much as Musk unbound? Is being unfiltered and untethered integral to who he is? Could you get the rockets to orbit or the transition to electric vehicles without accepting all aspects of him, hinged and unhinged? Sometimes great innovators are risk-seeking man-children who resist potty training. They can be reckless, cringeworthy, sometimes even toxic. They can also be crazy enough to change the world. And I think that's a fantastic conclusion to the episode, but to the story, his ongoing story for sure. Many people love him, many people hate him. I admire a lot of his accomplishments as an entrepreneur, but also do not want to model my life around him, especially when it comes to relationships. But yeah, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I've enjoyed reading and learning about Elon Musk, and also just reminding myself that it's okay to think big, dream big, and shoot for the sky. Please like this podcast and follow us on your podcast player to catch new episodes. You can find us on social media under the name Immigreats. Also, you can visit our website at immigreats.net and enter your email address to join the growing Immigreats community. Until next time,